Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. So to start things off today, I want you to close your eyes for just a second.
Oh, good.
And I want you to completely erase that, that highly romanticized sort of Sherlock Holmes version of Victorian London you probably have in your head.
Oh, right. The fog-shrouded cobblestones, the top hats.
Exactly. Banished. Forget the elegant, handsome cabs clipping through the night. Forget the gentlemen solving polite mysteries in drawing rooms. Instead, I am pulling you into this visceral, foul-smelling, just desperate reality.
It is a totally different world.
It really is. The year is 1861. You are standing in the St. Giles Rookery, specifically on a very narrow thoroughfare called Dudley Street. And this area, it is so dense, so intensely dark, and so profoundly impoverished that the respectable citizens living just a few miles away, they pretend it doesn't even exist.
Yeah, they completely ignored it.
Right. You are navigating this volatile world of pickpockets, immense religious tension, and this crushing, suffocating poverty that, honestly, it defies modern comprehension.
It really does. And to guide you through this underworld today, we are opening up a truly remarkable source for this deep dive.
Yes, this is a fascinating one.
It is. We're looking at a book by Donald M. Lewis, and it's called In Darkest London, the manuscript journal of Joseph Oppenheimer, city missionary. And the mission of our conversation today, what we really want to dig into is exploring this incredibly rare, firsthand, entirely unedited manuscript.
Unedited being the key word there.
Exactly. We are looking at the private, daily log of a man who spent his life, quite literally, just knocking on the doors of London's most destitute, forgotten citizens.
When you think of history, I think it is so easy to default to grand, sweeping political movements, right? Kings and queens, prime ministers, the signing of treaties.
The big macro events, yeah.
Right, the marching of armies. But today, we are zooming all the way in. You are going to hear the exact words spoken by starving cobblers, skeptical shopkeepers, and desperate mothers on a random Tuesday in 1861.
It's microhistory at its best.
It really is. But before we step onto those streets, let's just set the rules of the road for this deep dive. We are examining this journal strictly through the lens of historical fact. We are acting as impartial guides to the religious and social dynamics of the era.
Right. We are not here to endorse any specific theological viewpoint, whether that's Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, or anything else.
Exactly. The goal is simply to listen to the unfiltered voices of the past and, try to understand the world they actually inhabited.
And to understand the seeds our missionary was trying to plant, you first have to understand the incredibly harsh soil of his environment.
Oh, absolutely. The environment was brutal.
We need to physically map out the geography of despair that was the St. Giles Rookery, focusing specifically on the Seven Dials area. Because by the mid-19th century, London was just buckling under this unprecedented population explosion.
The numbers are wild. It had grown from under 1 million inhabitants in 1801 to over 2 million by 1851, right?
Exactly. It became the world's first truly modern metropolis. But, and this is the crucial part, its infrastructure was fundamentally medieval.
It just couldn't handle the people.
No, it could not handle the massive influx of people fleeing rural agricultural poverty, nor the thousands of desperate refugees pouring in from the devastating Irish potato famine.
And all of that human desperation just concentrated in places like St. Giles. Reading through the descriptions in the source, this area wasn't just poor, it was considered London's social and moral cesspool.
That was literally the reputation it had.
But it is the physical reality that hits you first, I think. The smell, it was allegedly so overpowering that outsiders would physically retch when they crossed the boundary into the neighborhood.
Yeah, and the Victorian understanding of that smell, it's critical context here. They subscribed to what was called the miasmatic theory of disease.
Right, the miasma.
Yeah. The leading public health figures and sanitation reformers of the day, men like Sir Edwin Chadwick, they went before parliamentary committees and argued with absolute scientific conviction that, and I quote, all smell is disease.
Wait, all smell is disease, not just a symptom, but the disease itself.
Exactly. They believed that rotting organic matter, untreated sewage flowing in the streets, the decomposing corpses of animals in the gutters, overflowing cesspits, they thought all of this created a malodorous bad air, or miasma.
Wow.
And breathing this stench, they genuinely believed, was the literal mechanism that made a person sick with typhus or cholera.
So it wasn't a modern understanding at all where we smell decay and think, bacteria is present, I should wash my hands.
No, not at all.
They believed the odor itself was the pathogen. That is terrifying to imagine. You are walking down a street, you smell something horrific, and you genuinely believe that the scent entering your nostrils is currently infecting you with a fatal disease.
It was a very real, very visceral fear.
And into this miasma of fear and filth, you have this tiny, intensely crowded stretch called Dudley Street, which was formerly known as Monmouth Street. And the commerce happening here, it's just mind-boggling. The author refers to it as the rag fair of the West.
Yes, the dolly shops.
The dolly shops. The main economic engines were these places called dolly shops. I actually had to pause when I read about how these function.
They are pretty shocking.
They really are. These were establishments where the absolute poorest of the poor traded rags. Not pocket watches, not silver spoons, not even old boots. Literal, unwashed rags that standard pawn shops wouldn't even allow through the door.
Because standard pawn shops had some level of quality control. The dolly shops operated on the absolute fringes of survival economics. And they were marked by this really unsettling historical artifact. They used these racist, brown-skinned doll logos hanging outside the doors.
Which was basically a signal, right?
Right. It signaled to the largely illiterate population exactly what kind of business was being conducted there. And the commerce didn't even happen indoors in a traditional sense. The pavements themselves were used as display counters, just overflowing with damp, rotting fabrics.
And the actual shops were located down in the cellars beneath the street.
Exactly. It wasn't just a neighborhood. It was this physical ecosystem of desperation. The cellars operated almost like the bilges of a sinking ship. All the water, all the waste, and all the poorest people eventually just flowed down to the absolute lowest, darkest point.
The densification was so extreme that families were quite literally driven underground.
It really forces you to imagine a society utterly devoid of zoning laws, safety regulations, or, maximum occupancy limits. It was a free-for-all.
And the permanence of this underground society is what's really shocking. The book brings in an investigative report by a journalist named James Greenwood, written in 1873.
Which is over a decade after our missionary Oppenheimer was walking these streets.
Exactly, showing just how entrenched the poverty was. Greenwood decided to personally investigate a claim made by the medical officer of health, who had very proudly declared that not a single underground room in the district was still being illegally occupied.
Bureaucrats claiming the problem is solved when it totally isn't.
Right. So Greenwood goes to Dudley Street to verify this, and the scene he describes is straight out of a nightmare. He spots the open mouths of several cellars, luridly lit by fire and candlelight far below the pavement.
Just these glowing holes in the ground.
Yeah. He finds a narrow hole in the street, no larger than an ordinary paving stone, with this steep, treacherous ladder descending into the pitch black.
And then he watches a man emerge from one of these holes. It was a cobbler, or, in the slang of the day, a translator of old boots.
A translator. I love that term, even though the reality is grim.
It is. It was someone who took ruined shoes and somehow stitched them back together for pennies. Greenwood describes the man as sickly white, looking exactly like a coal miner coming up from a deep pit. He was wearing a cobbler's wax fillet tied around his head just to keep his lank, greasy hair out of his blinking eyes.
And the man only came up to street level just to wipe his face and try to get a single breath of air that wasn't actively suffocating him?
Just a gasp of that miasma air, which is barely an improvement.
Right. Greenwood looks down the length of the street and realizes there are 30 of these subterranean dens on this one block, just packed. They are filled with mothers nursing babies and older children wriggling up and down these steep ladders like rabbits in a warren. It really begs the question, how did the most powerful empire on earth let this happen right in its capital?
Well, it really exposes the tragic, fatal flaw of Victorian social policy, specifically their approach to slum clearance.
Which was basically just destruction.
Right. Pretty much. The prevailing governmental logic, which was heavily influenced by laissez-faire capitalism, dictated that the solution to a slum was simply to bulldoze it.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. So between 1842 and 1847, the authorities cleared out the notorious Church Lane Rookery to build a brand new thoroughfare called New Oxford Street. The goal was purely commercial.
They just wanted better traffic flow.
Right. Improve traffic and communication between the wealthy West End and the financial center of the city. So the government destroyed the homes of thousands of destitute people, but intentionally built zero replacement housing.
Zero. Because they assumed the free market would just naturally redistribute those displaced people elsewhere.
Which is absurd when you think about the economics of extreme poverty.
Completely. People living on a few pennies a week don't have the mobility to relocate to the nice new suburbs. They just shift one street over into the already overcrowded courts of Seven Dials.
And the landlords who own the remaining properties, they saw a massive influx of desperate renters, packed 10 people into a room instead of 5, and grew richer.
So into this literal subterranean nightmare of disease, crime, and crushing structural poverty, who actually has the courage or maybe the unfathomable dedication to walk door to door, descending those ladders every single day?
Well, the sower of the seed in this environment is our protagonist, Joseph Oppenheimer. And his profile, it defies every single expectation you might have of a typical English missionary.
Oh, totally.
He was a 24-year-old German-born Jewish immigrant who had converted to Protestant Christianity just a few years prior.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you there. The London City Mission is this heavily British, Anglican-leaning evangelical organization, and their strategic move is to send a 24-year-old German Jew, who presumably speaks English with a pretty heavy accent, into a horrific slum heavily populated by fiercely loyal Irish Catholics.
I know, it sounds crazy.
That sounds like a setup for absolute failure. Why him? Doesn't that seem like a massive mismatch?
It seems like a massive mismatch on the surface, absolutely. However, the minutes from his 1858 interview at the mission board reveal the strategic logic behind his hiring. Oppenheimer was the son of a shopkeeper, educated in Germany to be a teacher of ancient languages.
So he was very well educated.
Highly literate, fluent in German, English, and Hebrew. The board recorded that he was a young man of, quote, some respectability and intelligence. And to understand why that mattered, you have to look at the typical city mission workforce.
Okay, who are they usually hiring?
Most lay missionaries were drawn from the very rough working classes. Oppenheimer, by contrast, represented the lower middle class. He was unusually educated and possessed a deep, rigorous theological background. The board believed that his profound personal conversion story to Christianity, paired with his intellectual capability, made him a highly potent messenger. Even his accent marked him as an outsider.
Even so, they sent him into an absolute meat grinder. I mean, the physical toll this job demanded is staggering.
It was brutal.
We are talking about a young man made responsible for visiting between 500 and 550 individual families.
Yeah, that was his district.
The corporate rules of the mission stated he had to work 36 hours a week doing nothing but house-to-house visitation. That mandate didn't even include the various meetings, the tract distributions, and the administrative journaling he had to complete.
The 36 hours was just the face-to-face time in the slums.
Right. And his compensation for walking into hell every day, a salary of £65 a year.
Which was barely survival wages for a family. And the financial poverty of the position was eclipsed only by the profound physical danger. He was walking directly into the epicenter of typhus, cholera, and smallpox outbreaks.
Right. The miasma might have been fake, but the germs were very real.
Exactly. The miasma theory might have been scientifically wrong, but the danger of the environment was deadly. Waterborne and vector-borne diseases just decimated the slums. The book notes that in 1856, just 2 years before Oppenheimer began his work, 3 city missionaries died in a single week.
3 in 1 week.
And the very first missionary ever assigned to the St. Giles district back in 1847, he died from a fever contracted on the job. Oppenheimer himself suffered repeated severe physical breakdowns.
He would just push himself to the brink, right?
Yeah, he would work until his body gave out, requiring him to take months of unpaid or minimally paid leave just to recover enough strength to return to the cellars.
Which makes his story infinitely more stressful when you realize he wasn't some, solitary monk who only had his own life to lose. He had a family.
Yeah.
He married a woman named Jane Charlotte Andrews in 1859. And during the exact months this diary was being written, they had 2 infant daughters, Alice Ann and Constance Lavinia. He wasn't just risking his own life descending those ladders. He was carrying the microscopic dust of those miasma-filled rooms back to his wife and babies.
It's a terrifying thought.
It really is. So he is the boots on the ground, but he is executing a very strict playbook designed by men sitting in safe, clean boardrooms far away.
Yes. The London City Mission, or LCM, operated as a highly structured, almost militaristic machine. It was founded in 1835 by a Scotsman named David Naismith, and its most radical and controversial feature was its interdenominational nature.
Why was that controversial? I mean, why did the Anglicans and the nonconformists have such a bitter divide? They're all Protestants, right?
They are, but it was a deeply entrenched class and political conflict. The Church of England, the Anglicans, they represented the establishment. They had state power, immense wealth, and aristocratic backing.
The upper crust.
Exactly. The nonconformists, which included groups like the Baptists, Methodists, and Congregationalists, they were often comprised of the working classes and tradesmen. They operated outside the state apparatus.
Oh, I see.
So historically, the establishment viewed the nonconformists with immense suspicion, seeing them as potentially politically subversive. Naismith's vision to force these two fiercely opposed groups to sit on the same board and fund the same missionaries to reach the poor was practically unheard of.
I kept picturing the LCM as this tightly controlled corporate franchise. Because if you read about the Salvation Army later in the century, or the early Methodists, their revivals are loud, raucous, and deeply emotional.
Very loud.
There are brass bands, public weeping, shouting in the streets. The LCM is the complete opposite. It is silent, methodical, and heavily policed.
It was heavily policed, and that restraint was born out of a profound fear of what the Victorians called enthusiasm.
Enthusiasm, like just being excited.
Not exactly. The LCM, heavily influenced by its Anglican backers, viewed unbridled religious emotion, enthusiasm, as the first spark of social revolution. The cultural memory of the 17th century civil wars, where radical religious sects helped overthrow the monarchy, that was still a potent bogeyman for them.
Wow, they were still worried about that.
Oh, absolutely. The wealthy backers of the mission wanted to provide religion for the working class to civilize them and save their souls. But they were utterly terrified of religion of the working class. They did not want to empower the poor to lead their own movements or find their own ecstatic voices.
Keep them sedate, basically.
Exactly. Consequently, LCM agents, like Oppenheimer, were placed under a strict gag order. They were explicitly forbidden from preaching.
Wait. They weren't allowed to preach. Isn't preaching the entire fundamental purpose of being a missionary? How do you save souls if you can't deliver a sermon?
It sounds counterintuitive, but to understand their logic, we have to look at the theological framework driving them. The book outlines the 1858 Instructions to Missionaries, which was the literal, printed rule book Oppenheimer carried in his pocket. Historians often use a framework created by David Bevington to define this specific brand of 19th century evangelicalism.
Right, the 4 pillars.
Yes, it rests on 4 pillars, and the LCM rules align perfectly with them. The first is conversionism.
And I imagine this wasn't just about getting someone to politely attend a Sunday service.
Far from it. Conversionism is the foundational belief that a human life must be radically and fundamentally changed through a specific, often painful crisis of faith. Rule 2 of the LCM manual instructs the missionary to relentlessly stress, and this is a quote, the depravity of man, justification by faith alone, the necessity of a change of heart and of holiness of life.
Wow, that's heavy.
They wanted the people in those cellars to experience an agonizing realization of their own personal sin, followed by a profound internal spiritual pivot.
Which explains the second pillar, biblicism. Rule 3 demands that the missionary read the scriptures aloud. And the aloud part is key because a vast number of the people Oppenheimer was visiting were completely illiterate.
Yes, they couldn't read the tracts even if you left them.
Exactly. The evangelicals viewed the Bible as the ultimate literal standard of truth. If the Word of God had the power to change a heart, delivering the text verbatim without adding your own potentially flawed sermon to it was seen as the most pure method of delivery.
And that leads right into the third pillar driving this machine, which was crucicentrism. This is the intense theological focus on Christ's sacrifice on the cross as the sole, exclusive mechanism for human salvation.
So no grace through works or general goodness.
No. This wasn't a gentle theology of gradual self-improvement. It was a stark binary of eternal life or eternal damnation.
Which brings us to the fourth pillar, activism. And this is the engine that pushed Oppenheimer to the brink of physical collapse. Rule 13 tells the missionary, your work is awfully important. You have to deal with immortal souls whose eternal condition may be determined by the reception or rejection of the message which you deliver to them.
Just think about the weight of that.
The psychological weight of that sentence is crushing. If Oppenheimer takes a Tuesday afternoon off because his lungs hurt or he's exhausted, he genuinely believes that a cobbler in Dudley Street might die of typhus that night and burn in hell for eternity simply because Oppenheimer wasn't there to read the Gospel of John to him.
It was an overwhelming, terrifying burden. The rules were designed to keep the missionaries in a state of perpetual urgency. So, having established the man, his grueling environment, and his uncompromising rulebook, we can finally open the pages of his journal and examine what actually happened when he knocked on the doors of Dudley Street.
And this is where the historical record becomes incredibly vibrant. Oppenheimer is encountering vastly different soils, essentially different communities packed tightly into these slums. First, he steps into the Irish Catholic soil.
And there were a lot of them.
A huge amount. As we noted, Dudley Street was 44% Catholic. That is an astounding concentration when you consider the national average in England was around 4%. These were refugees of starvation.
Yes. They were traumatized, impoverished, and fiercely loyal to their Catholic faith, which really served as their primary cultural identity in a very hostile English city.
The English weren't exactly welcoming.
Not at all. And the established Catholic Church in England was initially ill-equipped to handle them. Historically, English Catholicism had survived the Reformation by retreating into the private chapels of wealthy landed aristocrats. Suddenly, London is flooded with a rough, destitute, Gaelic-speaking proletariat.
That's quite a clash.
It was. The aristocratic English Catholics often viewed these immigrants with embarrassment and wanted to keep them at arm's length. However, a radical shift known as the Second Spring was emerging within Catholicism at the time. Priests like Father William Kelly rejected the elite segregation. They advocated for building massive, splendid cathedrals directly in the center of the slums.
Right among the poor.
Exactly. Specifically for the poor to find dignity and beauty amidst the squalor.
And into this highly charged defensive atmosphere walks Joseph Oppenheimer, a German-Jewish Protestant convert representing an English evangelical organization. The journal entry from September 20, 1861, captures the friction perfectly. He knocks on the door of a Mr. Sullivan.
I love this encounter.
It's so revealing. Oppenheimer notes in his journal that Sullivan is immediately averse to the visit and wastes no time initiating a high-level theological standoff. Sullivan looks at this missionary and demands, "Where was your church before Luther and Henry VIII?"
That is a classic, highly educated Catholic apologetic challenge. Sullivan is attacking the historical legitimacy of Protestantism, arguing that it is a recent human invention rather than the unbroken lineage of the true church.
Right. And Oppenheimer doesn't flinch. He fires back in the upper chamber at Jerusalem and in the Bible.
It's a very sharp comeback.
It is a razor-sharp, purely Protestant rebuttal, arguing that the faith bypasses centuries of papal history and connects directly to the original apostles. It is fascinating because Oppenheimer isn't just handing out loaves of bread or blankets. He is engaging in rigorous theological sparring with impoverished laborers in a dingy room.
They're having intellectual debates in the slums, and his interactions shift dramatically when he engages with the Jewish community in his district. This is where his unique background gave him a very distinct advantage.
Right, because there are about 17 Jewish families operating businesses in the Dudley Street area.
Yes, and most of them were Sephardic Jews, meaning their ancestry traced back to the Iberian Peninsula. They had been established in England for generations, spoke English or Ladino, and were somewhat integrated into the local commerce as shopkeepers.
Which was a stark cultural contrast to Oppenheimer himself.
Exactly. He came from an Africanizing background in Germany, representing a different cultural lineage, speaking Yiddish and German, and having more recent roots in Central Europe.
But despite those internal cultural differences, he had a massive inness. He knew the Hebrew texts intimately, he understood the culture, and he spoke the theological language. The journal reveals these remarkably cordial, ongoing relationships. He visits a Mr. Benjamin, who owns a clothing shop, and a Mr. Emmanuel.
And he doesn't face the immediate hostility or defensive walls he encounters with the Irish Catholics.
No, they actually invite him in to debate. Oppenheimer leans heavily on the specific training he received at the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews, known as the LSJ. He uses complex arguments about how Jesus fulfills specific Old Testament prophecies. He leverages his own deeply personal conversion story as his primary tool of persuasion.
It really demonstrates the intellectual agility required to survive in the Rookery. He had to be a defensive debater in one room with an Irish Catholic and a nuanced theologian in the next with a Jewish shopkeeper.
But the intellectual debates really fade away when he encounters the women the Victorians euphemistically labeled the unfortunates, meaning the prostitutes.
Yeah, this is where the tone of the journal changes.
This segment of the journal is where the intellectualizing stops and the sheer human tragedy takes over. I want to take you down Monmouth Court, which was a dark, incredibly narrow passageway branching off Dudley Street. It is February 3rd, 1862. Oppenheimer knocks on a door and meets a woman named Jane King.
Jane King's story is so sad.
It's heartbreaking. She is alone in the room because her companion, her pimp, is out. Oppenheimer writes down her exact devastating words. She looks at him and tells him she wishes she were dead. She says, "I must suffer now for that wretch who seduced me. I got in it now and can't get out again."
She's completely trapped.
She explains that she is entirely trapped by financial debt to her companion. If she disobeys, he threatens to literally strip her naked, take the clothes off her back, and throw her into the freezing street.
And Jane King's narrative represents a massive, highly vulnerable demographic in Victorian London. The structural economics of the city were brutal to single women. Many were unskilled laborers, domestic servants, or seasonal dressmakers.
They lived on such a razor's edge.
They did. A single illness, a lost job, or an out-of-wedlock pregnancy could plunge a woman into absolute destitution overnight, leaving street walking as the only barrier to starvation.
And the evangelical response to this crisis was the rapid development of what they called rescue work. Right there in the slum, at 75 Dudley Street, an evangelical woman named Ellen Ranyard had established a working girls' dormitory.
It was designed to be a safe haven, right?
Yes, a physical escape from overcrowded rooms and predatory companions. The book also details a fascinating and somewhat aggressive tactic called the midnight meetings movement. Evangelicals would rent out large restaurants late at night. They would go into the streets, invite prostitutes inside, and provide massive, high-quality free meals.
Just trying to get them off the street for a few hours.
Right. And once the women were eating, the evangelicals would preach to them, begging them to leave their pimps and accept a place in a reformatory or an asylum. It was an intense strategy, but it was one of the very few tangible lifelines available to women like Jane King. Oppenheimer kept pleading with her to pack her things and run to the dormitory while her companion was away, but the psychological grip of her abuser was too strong. She was simply too terrified to leave.
And that really speaks to Oppenheimer's daily life. It was a relentless pendulum swing between what the author categorizes as the stony ground and the harvest.
The stony ground being the failures.
Yes. The stony ground represents the sheer, insurmountable despair that seemed entirely immune to his spiritual message.
You can feel the despair suffocating him through the pages. In October 1861, he forces his way into a room belonging to an elderly man. He notes the smell is so horrendous he can barely breathe. Inside, the scene is just apocalyptic. He finds 4 small children, ranging in age from 2 to 7, completely naked.
Completely naked in October in London.
Yes. There is absolutely no furniture in the room. No chairs, no tables, no beds, just the bare, filthy floorboards. The parents are out working 14-hour days just to afford the rent, leaving these freezing kids locked in this empty room with this unresponsive, elderly man.
They're horrific.
Oppenheimer tries to do his job. He tries to talk to the old man about the state of his immortal soul, but the man just stares blankly, offering a monotonous yes or no. Oppenheimer leaves a religious tract on the floor and walks out. And the sheer helplessness in his handwriting is palpable. How do you preach salvation to a freezing, naked 2-year-old?
You cannot. You really can't. And yet, he forced himself down the next ladder because, amidst the stony ground, he occasionally found the harvest.
The moments of hope.
Exactly. He found instances of profound, transcendent faith thriving in the absolute worst conditions imaginable. He regularly visited an elderly bedridden widow named Mrs. Piggins. Her 2 adult daughters were out of work, they had no money for medicine, and they were in a severely distressed state.
Just absolute poverty.
But when Oppenheimer sits beside her bed and asks her about her spiritual hope, she delivers a profoundly beautiful reply. She looks at the missionary and says, "He loves me in my poverty just as much as when I was better off."
Wow. He loves me in my poverty just as much as when I was better off. It is a stunning declaration of dignity. That single sentence is exactly what the London City Mission was desperate to find.
That was the goal.
But here is the ultimate fascinating irony of Oppenheimer's story. He is walking around, hyper-focused on saving individual souls for the afterlife, keeping this private little notebook to prove to his supervisor that he's doing his 36 hours. He has no idea that he and the other missionaries doing this work are actually fundamentally altering the British government and forcing society to change its laws.
Yes, they became accidental sociologists. To grasp how this happened, you must understand the absolute social isolation of the Victorian era.
The rich and the poor were completely separated.
Completely. The wealthy merchants living in the West End, the politicians debating in Parliament, the lords and ladies of high society, They literally knew less about the London slums located 2 miles from their townhouses than they knew about the interior of Africa or the far reaches of the British Empire in India. The segregation was complete.
So they just didn't see it?
No. The city missionaries were among the very few educated, highly literate people, aside from maybe a handful of dedicated physicians, who were regularly crossing those invisible borders and entering the deepest parts of the rookeries.
But wait, let's go back to his rule book for a second. Rule 10 of Oppenheimer's instructions strictly, explicitly forbade him from engaging in politics. It warned missionaries to avoid political subjects as altogether foreign from the purpose of your visit. If they are muzzled from talking about politics, how do they end up driving social reform?
That's the ironic part. They drove reform not by lobbying, but by acting as the ultimate fixers and guides, because they knew the labyrinth of alleys, because they knew exactly who lives in which cellar, and because they were somewhat trusted by the locals, they became indispensable to the era's social investigators.
Oh, I see. They were the tour guides.
Exactly. When the famous journalist Henry Mayhew wanted to write his groundbreaking, explosive investigative series, London Labor and the London Poor, he couldn't just walk into St. Giles alone. He would have been robbed, or worse. He relied heavily on city missionaries to safely navigate him through the darkness and introduce him to the costermongers and mudlarks.
And it wasn't just journalists, right?
No. When influential politicians like Lord Burghley wanted to see the reality of poverty firsthand, they shadowed missionaries like Oppenheimer on their daily routes.
They provided the access and the raw data.
Precisely. The meticulous information they gathered in their journals, the exact kind of documentation Oppenheimer was doing, was aggregated by the mission boards. This raw, undeniable data was then handed over to powerful evangelical reformers in the government, most notably Lord Shaftesbury.
And Shaftesbury was a major player.
Huge. Shaftesbury would stand up on the floor of Parliament holding these missionary reports and read the horrific accounts of 30 underground cellars on Dudley Street, or the 4 naked children freezing in an empty room. He used their apolitical diaries as political weapons to demand massive sanitary improvements and the first housing reform acts.
This exposure triggered a massive philosophical and theological earthquake because for decades, the prevailing economic and religious dogma in England was that poverty was a moral failing.
Right, it was your own fault.
The assumption was simple. If you were poor, it was because you were inherently lazy, a drunkard, or steeped in vice. Wealth was seen as a sign of God's favor and hard work.
But the missionaries' data completely dismantled that narrative. When you read a first-hand account of a child born into a damp, windowless cellar situated next to an open sewer, working 14 hours a day just to eat scraps, you can no longer blame that child's lack of a Protestant work ethic.
You just can't. The evangelicals began to wake up to a new reality. They realized that poverty wasn't just a moral deficit, it was an environmental crisis. It was driven by horrific urban planning, a complete lack of sanitation infrastructure, and the predatory greed of absentee landlords.
They finally understood that you cannot successfully preach morality and spiritual elevation to a human being who is actively starving and freezing to death in a literal hole in the ground.
The physical environment had to be reformed before the soul could be addressed.
But this relentless daily exposure to that toxic environment eventually broke our guide. In May 1862, Joseph Oppenheimer sits down and writes a letter of resignation to the London City Mission.
He just couldn't take it anymore.
His physical health is completely shattered by the miasma, the damp, and the exhaustion. He has a wife and 2 infant daughters whose survival depends on him. He realizes he physically cannot climb down another ladder into those cellars without dying. He leaves the mission. And given the mortality rate of his peers, you would expect his story to end in an early grave.
But this is where the historical record offers a truly surprising, almost cinematic twist. He doesn't die young in the slums. He leaves the mission and actually manages to recover his health.
A total pivot.
A huge pivot. Drawing on his German-Jewish family heritage, he remembers his roots as the son of a shopkeeper. He takes his family, moves across the River Thames to Lambeth, and sets up a shop right near the bustling Waterloo train station. He becomes a tobacco merchant.
It was a trade quite common and often very successful among Jewish businessmen in London during that era. So he transitions from saving souls to selling cigars to commuters.
And he doesn't just scrape by. He thrives in a way that is hard to fathom given where he started. He becomes incredibly wealthy. When Joseph Oppenheimer passes away in 1890, his probate records show he leaves an estate to his wife worth over £5,148.
In Victorian money, that is an absolute fortune.
It is, representing profound middle-class security.
It is a staggering trajectory. He goes from being an impoverished, zealous missionary walking the most dangerous, diseased streets in the British Empire for 65 pounds a year to a comfortable, wealthy, respected merchant living in the suburbs.
It is a surreal, deeply complicated journey. Think about the arc of this man's life. You have a young, highly educated German-Jewish immigrant who experiences a profound religious conversion. Driven by an intense theology, he walks willingly into the darkest hell of Victorian London, a place where humans literally live in holes in the pavement.
And he wrote it all down.
He documents the exact words of visceral fears, the bitter anger, and the stunning faith of people whom history would have otherwise completely erased. He writes it all down in this little notebook, fulfilling his 36 hours. And then his body fails, he pivots, and he quietly walks away into immense wealth, leaving his journal behind in an archive to be discovered over a century later.
His journal serves as a vital bridge. Not just a bridge between the isolated rich and the forgotten poor of his own era, but a bridge between his time and ours. It strips away the romanticism of the 19th century and forces us to confront the brutal reality of systemic poverty without the comforting, safe distance of fiction.
Which leaves you with a final thought to mull over today. Joseph Oppenheimer spent years of his youth risking his own lungs and his family's safety, trying desperately to transform darkest London. But in the end, London transformed him from a starving, idealistic missionary into a wealthy, comfortable tobacco merchant. It leaves you wondering, when you wade deeply into the most profound suffering of the world, is it actually possible to change the system, or does the system eventually just absorb you, reshape you, and send you on your way? Something to think about the next time you walk down a busy city street.